I'm going to give you an introduction to Tim Winton's short story, Aquifer. It comes from his 2004 anthology called The Turning. Now, Tim Winton is one of Western Australia's greatest writers, and it's a really great story of his that exemplifies his style and captures that Australian style of writing. It's about a man who revisits his childhood memories of a swamp-turned suburb, uncovering buried secrets and confronting guilt and a haunting tale of memory and environmental loss. Now, if you're familiar with Tim Winton, you might have read The Riders, you might have read Breath, or you might be more familiar with Cloud Street. It's arguably his most famous work. It's been turned into a movie, a stage play, and all of that. A lot of students have read it. It's a wonderful novel. So let's begin by looking at the themes and ideas that we see in this story. The first one to look at is memories in the past. It's about the persistence of childhood memories and their influence on the present. It also explores guilt and consequences, or the personal guilt linked with past actions and their emotional weight. Another key concern in this story is this idea of environmental loss. Winton uses the destruction of the swamp to comment on urbanization and humanity's disconnection from nature. And each of these themes intertwines, showing how personal and societal issues often mirror each other. Now let's have a look now at language in this story. Winton uses visual and tactile imagery, and it immerses the reader in the physicality of the swamp, highlighting its ominous, mysterious, and living presence. And this passage here is one that, if you're doing a close analysis, is really worth paying attention to, where he says, "A black swan rose from the water. I went on until the ground hardened with moisture and then went spongy with saturation. Scaly paperbarks keeled away in trains of black shadow. Reeds bristled like Venetian blinds in the breeze. Black water bled from the ground with a linoleum gleam." Now, the swamp symbolizes the buried secrets and repressed guilt. It reveals the inner conflict of the narrator. Now, imagery is also used to create contrast between the natural world and the invasion of urbanization. And we can see this when Winton tells us that at home on winter nights, great bonfires of fallen trees flickered in the sky above the yard. Beyond the fence, cicadas and birds whirred. Now and then, the hard laughter of ducks washed up the street. They sounded like mechanical clowns in a sideshow. Now, this auditory imagery juxtaposes natural sounds of birds and insects with this comparison of the mechanical clowns in a sideshow, this artificial almost laughter of the ducks, suggesting a discord between nature and human encroachment. And Winton employs rich imagery and metaphors to create vivid descriptions of the environment and evoke the narrator's emotional state. For example, the swamp is described as the swamp's eye and the water as the soup, the juice of things. Metaphors like these connect to the idea of the past being ever present. Now, a key characteristic of Winton's writing is his diction and tone. The story's language is often colloquial and reflective, and it mirrors the narrator's voice. The tone shifts between nostalgia, unease, and a detached observation of the changes around him. Now, a key thing in Winton's writing is how he really does capture that Australian vernacular, that colloquial way of speaking, and it rings out in his writing. It's a key aspect of his style. Now, we should move on to looking at the symbolism in the story. The first key symbol is the swamp itself. It represents the complexities of memory, guilt, and the past. It serves as a symbol of the natural world being encroached upon by urbanization. It links to the ideas of memory and the past because it holds Alan Mannering's remains, quite literally and symbolically, along with all the other things that have been lost as time has moved on. The other key symbol is the suburb. The changing suburb symbolizes progress and development, but also a loss of connection to nature and the past. I'd also encourage you to look at it as through a bit of a colonialist lens or a post-colonial lens, because we see that sort of commentary subtly weave throughout it as well. And here we have an interesting quote that reveals this. As they moved in, people planted buffalo grass and roses and put in rubber trees, which brought havoc to the septics a decade later. From high on the ridge, the city could be seen forming itself into a spearhead. It was coming our way, and it travelled inexorably in straight lines. Now, it's interesting the choices of what Winton talks about here with buffalo grass and roses and rubber trees. These are not indigenous to Western Australia. And it's part of that colonial way of thinking with throughout Australian history. Things have been imported that have wreaked havoc, and it hasn't always been a clear forethought to the future, let alone cultural significance. And in this case, it's the very practical invasion of the septic tanks. And if you're not familiar with what a septic tank is, in various parts of Perth and Western Australia, there isn't deep sewage. So people have tanks buried under the ground for their sewage waste. And often these plants would cause blockages. Look it up. All right. So now looking into our narrative techniques, this is a story that's written with first-person narration. It's told from the narrator's perspective. And reader shares the process of his struggle with guilt and his process of making meaning of his memory and connection to the landscape. But another key element, another key narrative technique that Winton uses is his non-linear structure. The narrative unfolds in non-chronological order. It jumps between the past and the present. It mirrors the narrator's stream of consciousness and the way memories resurface. Basically, by having this non-chronological structure, the past is always coexisting in the present. It's always resurfacing, like the bones of Alan Mannering in the swamp. Foreshadowing is another key technique. It creates a sense of unease and anticipation, hinting at the tragic events that will unfold and the lasting impact they'll have on the narrator. Early in the story, the narrator is jolted by a news report about bones discovered in a swamp. Description of the swamp as a place of secrets and hidden depths further contribute to the sense of foreshadowing. Now, it's also important to look at this in a broader context. And it's a story that is universal, but it's also very much about the Western Australian experience. Now, it's published in 2004, and it can be read as an interpretation of the changing world of Western Australia through a lens of 2004 values and beliefs. It's set in the context of Perth's rapid suburban growth in a post-war era. And this period saw significant changes in Australian society, including increased immigration and the rise of consumerism. It also contends with, it reflects the growing concerns about the environment and environmental degradation and the impact of human activity on the natural world. And this is something that recurs again and again throughout Winton's writing. And what I really appreciate about this story is how it contends with a growing sensitivity towards the marginalisation of First Nations people in Australia. We have the Jones family, who are sitting at the margins of this story, quite deliberately so, to reflect that marginalisation. And what's interesting in the suburb is that they are the last family that are there when the narrator comes back, but they are also being evicted at the same time. It's a really interesting take there on Australia's colonial past, living in the present and the ongoing impact of that colonisation. So Aquifer is a really interesting story, packed with ideas, packed with a really interesting language that captures that really distinctive style of Australian literature. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope this has given you some insights into how to look at this story a little bit more deeply. Good luck.